Let's be honest, we all bought the game or are thinking of buying the game because of our love for Valkyrie Profile. Square Enix is capitalizing on our nostalgia, and while that may be a great way for it to generate excitement for a series that hasn't seen a release since 2009, and yes, I'm going to ignore Anatomia for obvious reasons, they just shot themselves in the foot. After the disappointment that was DioField Chronicles, I didn't want to get my hopes up for Valkyrie Elysium, only to be met with a subpar game. This is indeed another challenge, as Valkyrie Profile Lenneth was a game that I thought was done exceptionally well, so the bar is set pretty high. It's clear that the developers tried to show some love by having a lot of throwbacks to the older games. The title screen features a meadow of weeping lilies, a significant place in the original game, as it also is in Elysium. Egon, the first recruitable in Harrier, reminded me a lot of Arngrim, and both backstories deal with a princess sharing a similar fate. And let's not forget Valkyrie's very cool signature attack, Nebelon Valesky, makes its way back as a powerful divine skill. I know there are way more references I'm missing, but the point should be clear. Yet for all this did, it still didn't really quite help turn the game around when it needed it the most. For the first time ever, it might actually have been better if I hadn't played Lenneth and was a new player altogether. This is typically how it is when I cover something new on the channel, and the one time it isn't, I get bitten in the ass. You probably already know why I'm saying this, and yes, it's because then I wouldn't have a point of comparison, and then it probably wouldn't have been as bad. It's like deciding to watch the live action version of an anime, and that's usually a decision only a person who wants to hurt themselves would make. Like a majority of Square Enix's newer titles, Valkyrie Elysium moves away from the turn-based combat of its predecessors to what all the cool kids are doing now, action combat. A change I'm beginning to find tiring. It was something I thought was done well in their Final Fantasy spin-off, Stranger of Paradise, but the feel of combat in Elysium is, how do you say, clunky. I'm sure this overused subjective word is a great way to describe with crystal clear clarity of what I mean, so let me explain further. The movement, attacks, and defensive actions don't really work in the way I want. It seems like combat should be fast-paced with the numerous inharriers that can be summoned to overwhelm enemies, and the fact that Soul Chain lets me stick to them easily. Yet it also seems like the developers did everything they could to slow it down. With the exception of guard cancel, which I and likely other blind players didn't know about, there's no animation cancel. But it's not really entirely the lack of this functionality that makes the controls feel bad. I'm fully committed to my attacks, which also seems to be buffered, so mashing buttons can work against me sometimes. I can't dash out of attacks, and I get that's how they wanted it, but I can't even air dash out of the way mid-jump, which feels lame. Inharriers can't be summoned mid-combo without a passive. It has the added effect of changing the elemental property, usually to a type I don't want, so that's always fun to deal with. There also isn't a quick rise when I get knocked down, so it feels like an eternity before I get back into the action, and there's no sprint, making the movement feel slow. These combinations make the gameplay feel sluggish and wrong, even though technically everything is working as designed. That said, amidst my fight against the controls as well as the enemies on screen, I did feel a tingle of what I believe to be the emotion of enjoyment. Yes, you heard that right. Even though combat did feel clunky at times, when things worked, I actually had some fun playing the game. There was a good variety of weapons that were interesting to use since they were all unique and offered something others didn't. Each one had their own combos to learn and properties to take advantage of, keeping the combat fresh. The enemy interactions also played a large role in this. Knocking enemies prone by abusing their elemental weaknesses using divine arts or the inharriers made combat engaging and gave me something to focus on to win fights. Finisher moves looked pretty cool as well and were easy to use. When defensive options worked, it added an even more rewarding feeling. Dodges generate souls that can be absorbed to perform a powerful combo attack. Parry specifically is one of the cooler moves that was very hard to time since it required attacking at the same time as the enemy, but would deflect their blow and slow down time. I also get a pair of wings, pretty shrey. These abilities seem like they would come standard with your Odin manufactured Valkyrie, but they actually had to be unlocked through progression. It's actually during this time that the combat is in its toughest state, because the shortcomings are even more apparent, with nothing to hide behind. There's also a CP cap on hard mode that limits the number of passives that can be active, which I think is pointless since it's just an artificial difficulty adjustment. It seems like they think this is a way for people to customize their builds, but turning off functionality is a bad way to implement that idea, especially when the skills are either functionally something that should be available by default, or they're just plain raw attack or defense increases. Well, on the bright side, as someone who likes to explore and complete all of the optional content before moving on, it was pretty easy to gather all the resources needed to unlock everything without needing to grind. Exploration, however, left much to be desired. The first level actually gave me an impression that it was going to be better than it was. I thought the world was going to be big enough to explore at my own leisure, with tasteful backtracking to collect rare chests and blossoms. I thought there was going to be more verticality in the movement, as I could get on top of the rooftops of destroyed buildings, and I have Soul Chain that acts like Link's hookshot. The reality soon came crashing down. Levels actually prevented me from exploring more often than not, with doors closing behind me or with invisible barriers created by Valkyrie herself. Most of the exploration was just being pushed forward on a narrow path, and I could count on one hand how many times I actually used Soul Chain to get to new areas. By extension, this also made replayability low. All of the side quests took place in the same areas, but with more restrictions instead of being given free reign to go wherever I wanted. Like exploration, the story was on a one-track path toward mediocrity. It suffers from some pacing issues and lack of details in their characters and narrative that would make it alluring. The main issue comes from Valkyrie, the supposed star of the show. She has as much personality as a brick wall with a frown face drawn on it. Logically speaking, that checks out, since she was created by Odin to be a tool in order to save the world, so it shouldn't be surprising that she's more of a doll than anything else. But man, the way she's portrayed really makes it tough to like her. All I could think about was how much cooler Lenneth was in the first Valkyrie profile. Even the mysterious new Valkyrie clad in black armor is more interesting, despite having less than a fraction of the screen time. Maybe the game should have made her the main character instead. Thankfully, the white Valkyrie doesn't stay that way for long, and starts to become humanized thanks to the souls she recruits as inheritors to help her in her quest. The more time she spends with them, the more she begins questioning the foundation of everything she believes in, and about the point of her task. It's a good idea, but one that isn't executed too well. For one, it seemed like her change happened way too quickly. For someone who is so devoted to her god and task, I would expect it would take a little more than a few lines of dialogue to change her mind. Like that of a life-changing tragedy. Cough cough, wink wink. The inheritors should also be the stars of the show, but they receive as much development as an abandoned puppy on the street. Not enough time is spent diving into their personalities, their past, or the regrets that tie them to this dying world. All I get is a few voices that I hear when looking for their soul, and finding a few items that don't hold any meaning until I read about their memories. Yep, that's right, I said read. The most crucial character revelations come from the 6 memories each inheritor has that are unlocked from completing their side quests. Once all this is done, the full picture of their downfall and the most significant part of their grief comes to light. It feels like a total cop-out when they could have added some cutscenes or pictures or something to visualize the stories to make it more impactful. They could have even just had Valkyrie do a bonding moment with a one-on-one to have them tell the story, which would have also helped develop empathy for her and show her growth. Well, I guess my imagination will just have to do. Ugh. That might actually be the better choice anyway, given the way the character models look and animate. Even though I complain about Valkyrie's doll-like nature, it doesn't help that characters in the game lack any sort of outward display of emotion. Lips don't match the voice lines, they all have the same blank emotionless stare, and there isn't any body language that makes the characters feel alive. Most of the cutscenes are just Valkyrie kneeling before Odin, who sits on his throne like a douche, with his legs crossed and hand holding up his weird-ass head. It's kind of funny that what I enjoyed most from the story came from things I read, and not so much things I experienced. I was more interested in the world building of the dying Midgard gleaned through the various hallowed blossoms. It gave me insight into the people struggling to live, those who gave up hope, and even the thoughts of some of the gods. These tidbits added context to the journey and gave exploring a ruined world a little more enjoyment, which, now that I hear it out loud, is a messed up thing to say. However, it's through this sense of dread and hope that makes Valkyrie's journey all the more endearing, and honestly, it needs it. At the end of the day, when it comes down to it, Valkyrie Elysium wasn't terrible. Hell, it was definitely a lot better than a few other games I've played in recent memory. The combat had its fun moments when I wasn't fighting the controls, and the story also had its highlights, though most of it was found in the final chapter of the game. The only thing that really gets me at the end of the day is that they almost got it right. Like, they were so close. Just a little more polish with the combat system and add some more content to the narrative, and it would have likely been so much better and worthy of the Valkyrie name. If they continue to release more games in this series, and I seriously hope they do, I feel like this is just the beginning. I believe they have the potential to create something great and memorable, just like in the olden days.